By now, you should begin reading Chapter 11, Section 5 of your e-text. It's just 3 or 4 pages, no big deal. And I'm going to present this information as a supplementary resource that will deepen what you're already learning. You do not need to take notes to stress out. I will make 2 recordings. I'll record half the slides and then the other half, so you can read some today and some on Monday. And let's just begin. We're going to talk about exploration and expansion, the Atlantic slave trade. We already know what the impetus was for Europeans to explore, and in so doing, and increasing their geographic knowledge, and trying to find the source of wealth, and locating a possible sea route to valuable Asian places, they learned new things, and they saw things they wanted to exploit. And they conquered land. So let's just look at the origins of slavery. Slavery has existed since forever, really. It is something that mankind has exacted upon each other for many, many years. The word slave actually comes from the large number of Slavs taken from southern Russia to work as unpaid laborers during Roman times. Now, slavery existed way before then, so this was just the name, the provenance of the name. Early slavery probably resulted from warring groups taking captives. And in Africa, there was intra-African slavery, and it was kind of akin to European serfdom. Serfdom was just a condition that most Europeans lived in the 15th century. So, for example, in the Ashanti Kingdom of West Africa, slaves had more rights than slaves did in the Americas during the slave trade. Slaves could marry, own property, and even own slaves. And they also had kind of a finite amount of time of servitude. So slavery ended after a certain number of years. And the other difference is that in African slavery, you could never pass down a person from one generation to another. So that didn't exist. You couldn't inherit slaves like you could in the Americas. So let's just look a little bit more at slavery in Africa before the Europeans came. Slavery really was developed under a different context. It represented one of the few methods of producing wealth available to common people. In Africa, private landholding was not recognized until after colonial officials began imposing European law in the 19th century, which means the 1800s. Land was typically held communally by villages or large clans, and these clans were allotted land according to the size of the family in need. So the amount of land a family needed was determined by the number of laborers that families could marshal to work the land. So to increase production, a clan had to invest in more laborers to increase their share of the land. So it was kind of a circle. And the simplest and quickest way to do this is to procure slaves. So to service this demand, many early African societies conducted slave raids on distant villages. So just remember, the more laborers, the bigger allotment of land they were given. Now, after the voyages of Columbus, slave traders found another market for slaves, New World plantation. So by the 1500s, the mid-1500s, in Portuguese Brazil and the Spanish Caribbean islands, colonists had turned to the quick and highly profitable cultivation of sugar. And this is a crop that required constant attention and exhausting labor. They tried to recruit Native Americans, but they were susceptible to diseases because they didn't have immunity. So they were just being torn apart by smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis. And the natives who survived wanted no part of the work. And they often fled to the countryside that they knew very well. So it was their country, so they knew where they could hide. So by the start of the 16th century, almost 200,000 Africans had been transported to Europe and the islands in the Atlantic because they had higher immunity to diseases and they were free. And they couldn't hide. So let's look here at the percentages. You'll see that at the beginning, about 37% of slaves went to Portuguese Brazil, and then 15% went to Spanish America, including the Caribbean, Spanish Caribbean, and then 41% went to the other Caribbean islands. A very small percent went to Europe and Asia, and British North America had about 4.5%. The reason is because there's a high demand for labor. They needed a lot of laborers. They wouldn't be able to necessarily afford to pay them all. So these were laborers for estates called plantations where cash crops such as sugar or tobacco were grown on a large scale. And like we discussed, there was a shortage of labor because Native Americans were killed by the millions from European diseases that they had no immunity to. And then indentured servants were just too expensive. So basically the history of European seaborne slave trade with Africa goes back even 50 years before Columbus's initial voyage to the Americas. And it began with the Portuguese. The Portuguese went to Africa in search of gold. And the first Europeans to come to Africa's west coast to trade were funded by Prince Henry the Navigator, who hoped to bring riches to Portugal. And in 1441, the Portuguese sailors obtained gold dust from traders on the western coast of Africa. The following year, they returned from Africa with gold dust and another type of cargo, 10 Africans. So Henry the Navigator was not a navigator himself, but he sponsored these trips. He was a nobleman of English, French, and Spanish descent, and he just had the reputation for sponsoring. So his Portuguese sailors would bring back the riches to him and whatever they had found. So in 1441, two of Henry's captains, Anton Goncalves and Nuno Tristão, I'm probably not saying these names right, separately set out to Cape Blanco on the western coast of Africa. And to the south of the Cape, they came across a market run by black Muslims dressed in white robes and turbans, and they received some gold dust. So the Portuguese crew seized about 12 Africans, but not as slaves. They were exhibits to show Prince Henry. And then the new captive also included a local chief who spoke Arabic, and the chief negotiated his own release. If he and a boy from his family were released to their homeland, they would provide other black slaves in exchange. So in 1442, Goncalves sailed back to Cape Bianco, and then returned with more gold dust and 10 black Africans. In the following years, they returned with 30 slaves. And then within 10 years, thousands of slaves had been transported by sea to Portugal and Portuguese islands. So it just kind of exploded from there. Let's look at the Elmina Castle. 40 years after the first human cargo traveled to Portugal, Portuguese sailors built a trading outpost at Storehouse on the Guinea coast with permission from a local African leader. And you see this fort here, Elmina. And it was one of the many trading posts built by Europeans along Africa's western coast. And later it kind of facilitated from being or transition from being a trading post for goods to a post for people. So initially, the purpose of Elmina Castle was to secure harbor for Portuguese vessels. The outposts were heavily armed against assault from the sea, and later they were an export spot for slaves. So Elmina Castle had several owners, and right now we're looking at the back so you can see how hard it would be to approach it. There were Portuguese owners, Dutch, and English. By the 18th century, 30,000 slaves passed through Elmina alone, yearly, en route to the Americas. That's a lot of people. And this well-known fort, like I said, it just provided a secure harbor for Portuguese ships. And Africans were either captured in warring raids or kidnapped and taken to the port by African slave traders. And there they were exchanged for iron, gunpowder, mirrors, knives, cloth, and beads brought by boat from Africa. So we're going to stop here, and I'll record more of the slides, the other half of the slides, and you can get to it after a break.